Boom. Boom. All right, y'all. I think we're good to go. So I'm about to make this thing happen here. Word. So welcome to our next big kind of lesson on JavaScript stuff. Last time we met, we started talking about JavaScript. We got set up with it. As a recap, if basically we need to install Node, we install VS Code, and we started writing our first bit of JavaScript using VS Code, which is really cool. So today I kind of want to talk about a lot of different things. And so this is kind of going to be a pretty, let's say, accelerated kind of topic in kind of how JavaScript works. So we're going to talk about a couple different things related to JavaScript. First thing we're going to talk about is something called the document object model. Then we're going to talk about how JavaScript connects to HTML, CSS, and then build an actual application that shows those two things off in a unique way, and so that y'all can get the sense of like what JavaScript really does when it relates to a web application. So first thing I wanted to do though is point y'all into the direction of a really helpful resource when it comes to all things web dev, right? And that is the W3 Schools. The W3 Schools is a online resource for web developers, and they have a number of free tutorials and references to like different programming related concepts that you need to know in the web. So if you go down to like tutorials, you can see all types of stuff, HTML and CSS, JavaScript. They even have some sections on React in here. They also have some server side stuff too. So if you were trying to learn some stuff on the server for JavaScript with Node, or connecting SQL and stuff like that, great resource. Can't overhype it enough. It's a really helpful place to go. So with some of the things that we're going to be talking about, there's, undoubtedly we're going to go pretty quick. So just want to make sure that y'all know where to go to get some really interesting resources and help. And we're actually going to start today off looking at one of the resources inside of the W3 Schools as it pertains to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let me just kind of scroll down here. If you were looking for like a refresher on some of the more important things we talked about with regards to how JavaScript works as a language, you can find that the W3 Schools has a lot of those different sections built out. So how to print, writing comments, variables, functions, everything we kind of touched on last class. And we're gonna go over that a little bit more today, but in a more practical context. So all types of stuff with JavaScript is in here. Then I'm looking for here, JavaScript HTML Dom. So one of the most important concepts that you're going to hear about a lot in the web dev community, especially as like new web developers, is this idea called the HTML Dom. And basically what this relates to is the way in which the DOM basically is an interface that allows for JavaScript to access and change the elements of an HTML document. And if you remember when we first was looking at getting started with our topics on like web dev stuff, I was talking to y'all about how web applications or websites, right, are mostly always going to involve HTML and CSS, right? And HTML and CSS basically form the backdrop of every website. Like HTML, I like to say, is the structure of the site. So you could think of it like HTML is like the skeleton of a website. CSS is almost like the style. So like the swag. I'm so sorry. I'm looking to the right because people in New York are going crazy. I know what they're doing out there. It's kind of crazy. But HTML is like the skeleton of the site, right? So everything you see and need to hold the site down is written in HTML, right? But then when it starts coming to styling and making it look nice, outside of the swag that I got clearly in this picture, CSS is where you kind of start defining things like style. So things like making this font look nice, positioning these elements, those types of things I did with CSS. You could use the Google Chrome developer tools again to very easily check out all of the HTML elements on a different website, and also some of the CSS that's tied to those various elements as well. So you can see some CSS written here. So while HTML and CSS are like the skeleton and the style, and like, I guess you could think of like the outer layer of like skin of your website, you know, no body would be complete without the ability to act and take actions, right? And this website doesn't necessarily have much actions on it, but, you know, if we take a look at a website that does that, you know, is a little bit more robust, most websites have some forms of actionable elements to them, right? Like if you're on SoundCloud, for instance, right? Like this website is full of actions, right? Once you find a song you like, you know, if I'm trying to hear that new Pooh Shiesty, if I'm trying to hear that new Gunna pushing P, you know what I'm saying? Like but just by pressing this button, play, right? Something's gonna take place on the site, right? On SoundCloud, the stream button, the stream term comes up, and there's a whole set of things happening. But how do we make it so that websites can communicate when those things happen, right? So for instance, if I push this button, right, and I get this song playing, right? How does the website know that once I press that button to do all of that, right? So there's a certain amount of kind of awareness that the website needs to have, that the user did something, but then also with the user doing that thing, something else should happen. So there's a kind of like responsivity and like reacting to user-based actions, or just things happening on the site in general, right? The actions that we want to take place. And that's exactly where JavaScript comes back up and becomes really important. JavaScript, while HTML is like the skeleton, CSS is like the outer layers and style, JavaScript really is the thing that makes the websites like intelligent and make it actionable. So JavaScript is a super important element to all websites, because it is really what makes them action oriented, and that's really important if you're trying to build something not so static like this, right? Which this is just regular HTML, CSS, but you're trying to build an actual, you know, something that's going to be connecting with users in more interactive ways, for sure. So that being said, right, how does JavaScript develop this kind of intelligence and give our websites this ability to make changes based on certain things happening? And that's exactly where this JavaScript HTML Dom comes up. And so the DOM stands for the Document Object Model. And I want y'all to mentally write that down, because that's a really important concept in web development, the Document Object Model. Basically, whenever a web page is loaded, the browser creates what's called a document object model of that page. So when we hear this word document, one of the things I want y'all to think about is HTML, because all HTML files, which we'll see in a bit, are structured with this as an HTML document. An HTML document is essentially just some text that defines that it's a document HTML type. And then we have these different elements that are written in HTML that are, we call tags, HTML tags. And each HTML tag represents a different part of the HTML document. So the HTML tag itself is the kind of like refers to the entire document. There's a head tag, which refers to the metadata of a web page. So the head is where you would define things like the title of the page, so the thing that shows up on your top tab. Any meta details related to kind of like internal knowledge of like how the website is structured, like the viewport or the character set, but also things like SEO content is normally put into the metadata of a website. Things like links to external style sheets, or links to, in this case, I was linking to a Google font that I wanted to use on this site, right? So those things aren't related to what actually is the structural things on this page. So we could call that metadata. And that metadata lives inside of the head of an HTML document. Another tag is the body. And the body is all of the visual elements that you see on a page. So you can see how now that I'm highlighting over this thing called the body tag, this whole web page is highlighted. And if I were to go to SoundCloud, right, and control click and inspect using the Chrome developer tools, same thing, right? There's clearly an HTML document here. It's a lot more sophisticated, so I'll close it up. But you can see that this, just like the other one, there's a doc type HTML kind of comment here up top here that lets us know that this is an HTML document. There's that HTML tag that represents the entire web page. There's the head that has a lot of the metadata. So here, SoundCloud probably has a lot more interesting stuff that's going on. So yeah, doing a lot of interesting things there in the head. And in the body is all the visual elements. So here's where actually, you know, if I kind of scroll through this, you're going to see it's highlighting the different visual components of this web page based on what I'm looking at. So every HTML document is comprised of a number of different elements, and these elements are tags, like I said, are what we kind of see on our web page. It's not only what we see, but also like kind of the details that the web page uses to load itself properly. And that's what the head and the body represents. When it comes to the DOM, and what we're talking about here is that whenever a web page is loaded, right, the browser creates what's called an object model out of that document. So out of this HTML document or this HTML document, right, the browser creates what's called an object model out of it. And if you remember from our last class talking about JavaScript, one of the most important data structure, like just data collections types in JavaScript is an object. And an object is kind of like, I guess you could call it like a struct, or like, it's like it is a data type that allows you to save other data types inside of it. It's a collection, right? So what this document object model does is allow for the HTML page document to be structured as a tree of objects. So starting from the root document or that root HTML tag, we can really kind of visualize all of the different elements inside of a web page just by way of the browser creating this object model for us. And this might not make basically what I'm trying to say here is that for every web page that you're working with, once it comes to the browser is able to turn all of the HTML elements that comprise that page into this tree-like structure that breaks down all of those elements as like nodes in the tree. So if you look here, we see document, right? Remember I said every HTML document is structured as a document. The root element is that HTML tag, right? So the top level tag is the HTML tag. And how HTML works is that there's tags nested inside of other tags. So the three most important tags for every HTML site are the HTML tag, the head, and the body. And what we see here with this tree of objects is that root level element of the head of the HTML, right? HTML tag. And then inside of that, you see the head tag and we see the body tag. Inside of the head tag, there might be all types of different things like the title, right? Or there might be inside of the body tag, all types of visual elements that we need to see. So every website's body elements are going to be different because every website looks different, right? Every website's head tags might look different as well because there's different types of metadata and stuff that people might want to put inside of their website. But every website has an HTML root element, a head, and a body for the most part. What this tree of objects does is it makes it easy for us to navigate through all of those different elements as well as their corresponding attributes. So every HTML element also has attributes. So an attribute kind of looks like this, right? For this meta tag, one of the attributes is a character set called char set. And this char set is given data, right, in the form of, it says UTF-8, right? So attributes basically get passed data that correspond to the various HTML element that we're looking at. And so if we look at more in this body, right? So one of the elements here is this div, and the div is kind of like an empty container kind of element in HTML. And I gave it some attributes like a class name and ID name. And inside, I put some other elements that were necessary. So the H1 element is a heading. And this allows us to write like some text as like in the format of a heading. And yeah, so when it comes to attributes, so certain elements will have attributes like class names or IDs, or with this link element, or with this link, this link tag, right? The href is an attribute. All the attributes are kind of on the browser given these various colors to correspond to them. But we use those attributes to basically pass data into whichever HTML tag we're talking about. So another big thing that the DOM does is give us access to those various attributes. So we not only can see the elements that are on a web page, but we can see the corresponding attributes that each of those elements has. And also we can see things like the text content that each of those elements might be having as well. So an H1 element, kind of like this, right? This H1 tag has my name as data. And then on the Google Chrome Developer Tools, I can play around, right? And just mess around with some of the data there. But this text content is also part of the DOM, right? It is part of what gets returned in this tree of objects, as we kind of can see here. So why are we talking about this, right? What's the purpose of all of this? Well, it is because the browser creates this DOM, or this tree of objects, that allows for JavaScript to get the power it needs to really dynamically change up all of the HTML content on a web page. And that's what makes JavaScript very intelligent, is like JavaScript then can see all of the HTML. It can run certain functions that can manipulate those HTMLs, those tags and those attributes, and even the text or any of the inner content. And that allows for websites to become very dynamic, because you can use JavaScript like a programming language to anticipate certain things, handle various actions, and conditionally make things happen based on the needs. With the object model, JavaScript gets the power it needs to change elements on the HTML page, or change all those elements, change the attributes, change any of the CSS styles, remove any of the elements and attributes, add new elements and attributes, and react to all the existing events on the page. So events are like clicks and drags and all the things that a user action that a user might take on a web page, pressing down a specific key, things like that. And JavaScript also can create new HTML events on the page as well. So the DOM is a really important concept to know. It's what connects HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in a very unique way. So a lot of what we're going to talk about and see in practice is, what does the document object model kind of look like in practice, and how do we use it to change these contents and styles and stuff like that. And if for all of y'all, I would highly recommend taking the time to go through the W3 schools kind of breakdown. It'll talk about all of the things that we're going to be talking about, like the DOM methods and stuff like that. So we're going to come back to some of these as we kind of go through the lesson. But I just wanted to kind of give an introduction to how the HTML DOM is as an interface is important to the kind of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript structure. We use HTML to define basically how we want to mark up a website, right? So like I mentioned, every website starts out with that doc type HTML, the HTML tag, a head, and the body. And that really is it, right? There's all types of HTML elements. There's so many HTML elements. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that. It's hard to imagine that you would learn all of them. I wish this wasn't the link I wanted to go to, but somewhere here on the W3 schools, they have a reference to all of the tags oh, here it is. Right. So just look at how long this list is of HTML tags, right? So it would be crazy to just expect yourself to learn all of these tags, right? It's not necessarily what happens, but What does happen is we kind of commonly use certain tags often, right? The HTML tag, which defines the root of the document, the head tag, which contains the metadata and information you need, the body tag, which is somewhere else up here, you know what I'm saying? Which defines the document body, right? All of those various, all of that information is defined there, and HTML creates that structure for us. Then CSS, right, is the style of a document. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about CSS, but CSS basically takes those different elements and tells us how do we want to style it, right? Like, what is the background color going to be? Like, how do we want to align the text or align that particular item, right? And there's a bunch that goes into CSS, even with just like how advanced you can make these kind of specifications of the style and whatnot. And then lastly, we have JavaScript, which, like we've been talking about, is a programming language. So JavaScript is more practical of like what all you can do with it related to like the programming language environments and stuff like that. But with that added element of the HTML Dom, that's where we get the ability to connect these three. And so today we're going to talk a lot more about how these three things get connected and see it in a more practical context. But before I move forward, just kind of show thumbs or whatnot. If that's making sense a little bit, I know that there's a lot to cover in HTML and CSS that we didn't talk on, but if that makes sense of how those three things are connected, appreciate that. Dope. Okay, dope. Oh, wow. Appreciate y'all. You know what I'm saying? I'm out here trying my best, break this content down for y'all. You know what I'm saying? Cool. If you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. And once I get a nice break, I'll definitely kind of run through those questions. Okay, cool. So the DOM is a really important concept. So long as you got that, so long as you understand HTML is the structure of the site, CSS is the style, and JavaScript is what makes it smart and intelligent and makes things happen. And the HTML DOM is what JavaScript uses to get the power it needs to do that. We're in good shape here. Everything else we're going to see kind of in a practical context right now. So unfortunately, we're not going to be building SoundCloud today. You know what I mean? We'll probably build SoundCloud next week. No, I'm just kidding. But you can think about building SoundCloud if you want by the end of these sessions. You know, I definitely think that you'll be in a place where you can think about something like that. What we're going to build, though, is a fully kind of functioning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript project. And so in order to do that, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and kind of just start a new project and kind of walk y'all through how I would go about connecting these three things. And as I'm doing that, talking y'all through everything that we're going to see. So, you know, take a quick second, get yourself together, and yeah, we're going to go right in. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to go back to VS Code, right? Where I'm going to start writing out the files that I'm going to be using for this project. So within VS Code, like I told y'all, VS Code is an application that you can download on your computer, whether you use Windows or Mac. I'm using a Mac, and it allows you. It's called a text editor. So we use this program to write the files that are the code for any of our projects, right? And in the last session and video, I talked a lot about why I like VS Code is because it's easy to use. It also has a lot of extensions. I'm going to show you one of the extensions that I really like with VS Code. Turns out within this class and session, we're not going to use it, this particular extension, but for the purpose of this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript exercise we're going to do, it's actually a really helpful extension. So in order to start a new project, right, especially in a HTML, CSS kind of context, right, first thing I want to do is kind of get my file structure together and create a folder to hold this project in. So what I'm going to do is just file. I'm going to just do open folder so I can just create a new folder for myself with this project details. So I'll just do it in this temporary folder on my computer. And yeah, it's just kind of new folder and call it. So we're going to be building Tic Tac Toe. And in this Tic Tac Toe game, you're going to see all of the different facets of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I'm just going to call it Tic Tac Toe. So cool, got this new folder, just going to open it. And one of the reasons why I like to open a new folder is because whenever you use VS Code and you open a folder, it really makes your life easier, and it automatically in the VS Code terminal takes you inside of that folder. So now you can see I'm already inside that Tic Tac Toe folder. So I don't got to worry about when I open this terminal, being in the wrong place. Everything that I start messing around with files wise here is going to show up in this terminal here as well. So I'll just close these various things that I don't need right now. And cool. So how do we start new projects, right? Especially like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So this is something that if you're someone who's gonna code a bunch of HTML web pages for yourself, this is something you're probably gonna wanna do often. Luckily for us, when we use React, some of this process is kind of done for us, which makes our lives a little easier. But let's say we're not using a library like React or anything like that. We're just doing a new project from scratch. Well, the most important first file that you need to create, and I'm using this quick shortcut to create a new file in VS Code, is a file called the index.html. And the index.html is like think of it like your main HTML file. This is the first file that your computer is going to look for when it comes to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript projects. So every home page of a website, for the most part, has the index.html as its defaulted file. So this is the default file that people are looking for, computers are looking for when it comes to HTML. So we're going to start with that index.html, but later what I'm going to do is I'm going to have some CSS and JavaScript added to it. But let's just talk about the HTML for a bit. So with HTML, like I told y'all before, this is the structure of a website, right? This is the skeleton we need in order to like see the things that we really want to show up on the web page. So in order to do that, there's 3 important tags, like I mentioned, that we need to have in order to start seeing some stuff on this HTML file, right? So the first thing you need to do whenever you're starting a new HTML file is open up this doc type HTML that is kind of like it just lets the browser know that we're looking at an HTML file. So every HTML document starts out with this doc type HTML line at the top. And then the first thing you need is the HTML open tag. And VS Code makes it really helpful. Once you start typing the name of a tag, it'll close that tag for you. So what you're seeing here is the open tag, and you're seeing the close tag. This backslash or forward slash situation here, whenever you see an open tag, the tag gets open, and then you need to see some type of closing in the format of this, or in certain cases, we'll see that a tag might close from the same line if there's no data that's nested inside of it. So first, we got our first tag in here, and the HTML element it represents the root of our document. So if we think back to that document object model, we have this root element now kind of defined, that anything underneath this or inside of this is now a part of that HTML document. So cool. So the next element we want to define is the head. And so the head is the element that represents a collection of metadata for the document. And we'll talk a little bit about that metadata piece in a bit. The last tag we need to start with is the body element. And the body tag represents the element for all of the content of the document. So everything we were seeing before. So this is a very simple, empty, but simple HTML document. I could save this right now, and if I ran this in a browser, I'd see something, but it wouldn't be very helpful because there's no actually elements defined in here outside of the main kind of elements tied to the HTML document. So let's add a couple elements in here, and then we'll figure out how to run this and see it as a web page. So first, let's start with the head, right? And we know with the head that the point of the head is to store metadata, right, for the document. So what kind of things? What are metadata? Like, what metadata is there to store? Well, one really important metadata piece that people like to store in the head is the title, right? And the title kind of corresponds to the title of the web page. So when I go to any browser, you know, there's always some title for a web page in the tab. That is where we define that in the title element. So here I'm just going to kind of name it like Tic Tac Toe. Cool. So I got that title going. And then other types of metadata here in the head that you might see, character sets, which kind of define what types of characters is this document using and will the site be using as a whole. The viewport, which kind of defines the basically the HTML document's awareness of like the width and kind of scale that it should take initially. Then there's all types of other types of metadata related to like SEO and like kind of giving the website like different keywords that we might want to have in there. So metadata kind of SEO stuff kind of always goes in the head for the most part. Yeah, but the title is a really important one. So for the sake of keeping it simple, we'll kind of do that. And then in the body, this is where it kind of gets really interesting. This is where we put all of the HTML that the user is going to see. So to start, I'm just going to put a simple heading in there that is going to say, I'm just going to say, let's play Tic Tac Toe. Cool. And I'm going to save this. And then if I look for this file, so I'm just going to use the command. I'm going to use the command line to open this file in my browser or in my on my computer, just so I can see where it's at. So here's that HTML file I just created, right? So one of the things that you can do within your browser is open different files, right? So I'm actually going to open this HTML file we just created so that we can see it in our within the browser. So I'm just going to double click, open this file real quick. And cool. So this is a file that's using this particular it's opening that particular index.html that's on my computer that I just created. And there we see at the top, the tab has the Tic Tac Toe name, and then the header that we have in there is there as well. So cool, we got something showing up visually on there, which is great. I could go back to VS Code and I can just start playing around a little bit more. So instead of saying, let's play Tic Tac Toe, I'm just gonna make this say Tic Tac Toe. And then just for the sake of kind of making sure that this is working, I'm gonna say first to get 3 in a row wins. Save this, and I go back here, and there's no updates, right? But if I refresh this, clearly I'm seeing some updates happening here within this thing. So this kind of brings me to a good point of like one of the important things to know about HTML is it's a static file, right? So it's not going to change dynamically unless you make it so that it changes dynamically. And one of the ways to do that is to have this HTML file hosted on a server that can reload every time that there's changes to the files that we're using. So one of the extensions that I really like to use when I'm working with just general HTML on VS Code, and like it's just vanilla HTML. I don't use this in React, but React actually has a system that does this for us. It's called a live server. So if you're using VS Code, you can actually download extensions on VS Code by opening the extensions tab, which is like this like block looking thing here. And you can search for extensions that VS Code has. So one of the extensions that I really like is called Live Server. I already have it installed, but if you typed it in VS Code, you should see one that's like Ritwick Day Live Server. And it basically says it launches a development server for you with a live reload feature for static and dynamic pages. So what this server does is essentially it listens for any changes to any of the files that are hosted in your folder. And it reloads the server every time one of those files gets changed. So that's really helpful because, once I install that live server, I can open I can open this HTML file with the live server. So rather than have this file open from just like my static files like this, I can actually have this open from a specific local server, which, you know, for the sake of just what it's going to help us do real quick is going to make it so I don't have to reload all the time when I'm making these changes. So if I like, you know, for the sake of real quick, just kind of bring these things side by side. And then here, you know, Tic Tac Toe, first you get 3 in a row wins, or maybe I make a message here and I say, you know, X goes first, right? And when I save, clearly the server is reloading, which makes my life easier as a dev because I don't have to continuously make those changes because the server is listening for those changes for me, right? So that's cool. It makes my life a lot easier. We'll talk a lot more about the server side stuff, but essentially all you got to know is 127.0.0.1 is my local server. It's a local host server. So you can't actually type this in and go to this on your computer, but I can use this as a local server to use to just for development purposes. And servers are really helpful with HTML. Every HTML file at the end of it, when you want it to be hosted and people to see it, has to be put on a server. So it's cool that we can use this little test server from VS Code. Great. So we kind of got our first little feet wet with HTML, right? Kind of got the most important elements in here, and we kind of of got a server up so we can see those changes being made over time. So let's figure out now how we're going to actually build out this tic-tac-toe game and kind of make that happen. So I'm going to put in a bunch of stuff and then we're kind of talk through it after we get to a various section or whatnot. So cool. So first thing I'm going to do is I want to figure out how can we make our board, right? So I want to see kind of a big board for our tic-tac-toe game. And, you know, there's all types of ways to do this with CSS, but, you know, for the sake of what I'm thinking about, I'm going to use an element called a div. And a div is basically a container-like element in HTML that you can use in order to hold other elements. So like it says here, it has really no special meaning. It's not like it does something specific, but it's like an empty container, and it takes the size of any of the elements that are put inside of it, and it also makes it very easy to then like style things. So we'll see why this div kind of makes sense in a bit. But the first thing I want to do is kind of get a square to show up, right? Because the board is like 9 squares. So first thing I want to do is kind of just style this to like see kind of a square pop up. And so this is where HTML and CSS start to merge, right? Because I can have this thing here as a structure, but a div doesn't really show anything, right? And if I want it to be a square, all I really need is for there to be kind of a border to it, right? What the div does is, I'll just kind of put this here as a start, right? So we see these kind of dots right here. If I were to inspect this element, let me just move this a little bit so this could get a little bit bigger. So those dots that I'm highlighting are here, right? And the div is the element. But as you can see, highlighting the div basically, as you can see, I'm capping, you can't see this, but basically this div is highlighting that those dots, if you can kind of see that, right? So those 4 dots or whatever that I put in there, this div is highlighting that. So as this thing kind of takes its own shape, right? As this thing has its own shape, and like more gets added to it, well, it's not gonna help me in this example, but the div takes the shape of all the elements inside of it, text or whatever elements are in there. So technically what I want to do is figure out how can I make this div look more like a square, right? And so anytime I'm starting to think about styling, and for the sake of this, you know, what I really want to have happen is there be kind of some kind of a box looking thing here. And a div makes a great box because it just will take up whatever space I tell it to take up, and I can style that particular div. So this is where HTML and CSS start to get connected because, with HTML elements alone, there's only so much that you can do. But once you really want to get into the styling thing, you're going to need some CSS. So first thing we're going to want to do is create a CSS file. So inside of this Tic Tac Toe folder that I started with the index.html, I'm going to actually create a new folder that's going to store my CSS. There's no point in it being in a folder outside of the fact that for organization purposes. So you could just kind of have your own CSS file in here as well, but I'm just going to make a folder to make it a little bit more structured. And so I'm going to call that folder style.css or call that file style.css, right? And we're going to start defining this CSS file. So CSS, while HTML is basically about kind of using these elements inside of the body tag to kind of define your web page, and inside of the head tag to define like the metadata, CSS is where we start defining the style. So there's all types of things that we can do with CSS in order to style different elements. And CSS allows us to do a couple different things called, in the process of selecting elements that we want to style. One thing that you can do with CSS is very, very specifically choose an HTML element to look for, right? And give that element what's called a rule. And so inside of this block is the rule. Everything on the left side is called a selector. And CSS lets you select basically elements that you want to use and then change those elements based on certain style parameters. So for instance, say that div that I have in my HTML file, right? I have one div in here. And maybe I want to make this div look more like a box. So I can use the CSS to say, hey, take all these divs and turn them, style them a certain type of way. And that's exactly what I'm going to do in order to give myself, just to give myself some support in making this this box-like element a little bit more robust. So what I'm going to do is basically just kind of take this div and I'm going to say, okay, hey, I'm going to give it a height, right? And I'm going to give it a height of, let's say 140 pixels. CSS, you kind of use key values for defining your style. So on the left-hand side, you have a key. On the right-hand side, you have a value, and you end it with a semicolon. So give it a height of 140 pixels. I'll give it a width of 140 pixels. And just with this, I'm going to save this. But then I also got there's one more thing I got to do, my fault. So I give it a height and a width, right? But clearly nothing's happening. And that's because this CSS file actually isn't connected to this HTML file yet at all. So one thing I'm going to do is connect them. So back in the HTML, how we connect the CSS file is kind of a interesting process that relates to the idea of the head and metadata, right? We want our HTML document to know that, hey, there's a CSS file that's going to be linked to you that's going to have some style information. So inside of the head, I'm going to say, okay, cool. And I'm going to use a new element called a link element. And the link element basically takes in a couple elements with attributes. It has what's attribute called an href. And the href basically points to a specific URL. So in this case, there's a local CSS file that I want to make use of. It's in my CSS folder called style.css. Another attribute that you can use for the link element, is called the relationship, which tells us like what is this link kind of doing as a relationship, and style sheet is one of the parameters that we can pass into this. And then the last one is the type. So the type of this particular element that we're linking is a text CSS, right? And so, cool. So this link element is the element that essentially connects our CSS and HTML. It says, hey, this style.css is a style sheet that we're linking to this particular HTML. So when I save this, we still don't see, okay, we see something happening here, but we don't see anything kind of substantial. But we have this div of width 140 pixels and height 140 pixels. So let's add another, let's just add some more style to it to kind of see what's going on with regards to this particular div now. And so if I were to add one more, like one more set of parameters, right? Maybe I want to add a border so we can see something around this box. I'm gonna give it border. Borders in CSS take a set of pixels of how thick we want the border to be, the type of border, so you could make it like a solid border, and then the RGBA values of that particular border. So you can give it a very specific RGBA, or you can actually give it just a color name that is common, like a color name like black, right? So just kind of give it black. And as you can see, this div is styled with the CSS. It has the height of 140 pixels, the width of 140 pixels, and the black border, which basically is our square. So to make a long story short, now that we have this style sheet connected, we can take some of these elements and give them specific attributes that are style attributes. And just to go back to that image of the DOM that I just now remembered I don't have no more, I think it's here. Remember that the DOM not only refers to the elements, right, but also their attributes. So that link has that href attribute, or there's some styles now associated with these elements. So CSS is allowing us to put all of these different things into context and give our elements some style that we can see. Two of the most important attributes that we want to talk about, or that you're going to want to know with regards to HTML-like elements, are the ID attribute and the class attribute. The ID and class attributes are two attributes that we can use to give elements very specific, almost like identifying tags, so that we can see within CSS how to target some of those specific elements more than anything. So for instance, if I were to continue trying to build this board, right? We know that there's nine boxes for Tic Tac Toe board. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? And because right now in my CSS, I'm targeting every single div, all those divs are going to get the same style because of how it's being targeted, which is good in the case that, for these 9 boxes or for these 9 divs, I do want those to be the case. But what if I want somewhere else to be another div that's not technically a part of the board, right? And maybe that div just has some text inside of it, like, or maybe like a button or something, right? Technically, then I wouldn't want that extra box to just be, given the same styles. So it might make sense for me to target these elements a little bit differently. So rather than just saying, hey, for every div, let's do this, maybe it makes more sense for me to target certain specific divs and give those divs that style. And that's where the ID and class attribute becomes really helpful. So for instance, in any HTML element, you can give it a specific class or ID. And so the difference between a class-based element attribute is that classes are attributes that multiple items can share. IDs, whoops, didn't mean to click this. IDs are also attributes for identifying elements, but they're unique. So you can only use them one time with one element in a document. So it wouldn't make sense if I want all 9 of these boxes to be styled with the same stuff. I wouldn't want to use ID because that's only going to work for a specific element. But if I use if I keep clicking this thing, if I use the class, I can make sure that these 9 elements share the same class name, so they get styled the same way. And that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to give these elements a class name of square. So every element inside of this, every element inside of here. Ooh. Let me see. Let me do this. I just want to make all those divs have a specific class name. And then because I give these divs a specific class name, well, that means that now I can also, instead of just using my CSS to target every div, I can target just the class name, like just the things that have that particular class name. And so in CSS, to target a class name, you use the dot, use a dot, and then you can put the name of a class. So I'm gonna actually just say square. So here, now this, and one of the cool things VS Code does is if you highlight over any CSS rules that you write, it tells you what element is gonna get those specific rules. So here it's saying any element with a class name square is gonna get these particular rules, which is cool because now if you see, as I save this, oh, what just happened? Oh, I didn't save this part. Now that I saved this, right? All 9 of these boxes are here, but that extra box that doesn't have that square element inside of it, this one wasn't given a border, right? So if I save that one and kind of scroll down, you see that one wasn't given a border underneath there. So class and ID attributes are really helpful because they kind of make our lives easier with defining elements with specific types of attributes. So HTML is great because we can write the tags, right? And all of that's great. And then with the ID and class-based attributes, we can use the we can give those specific HTML elements some unique identifying information that we can connect to with regards to CSS. And that's how CSS and HTML work out, is like, I can use CSS to define, like, you know, for that H1 element, maybe I want to have some, some information for, you know, all of this text above here, right? And I want to give that some particular alignment or something, right? So I can style that particular H1, right? And or every H1 and say, hey, for every heading in here, you know what I mean? Like, I want to change the font size or something, right? And maybe make the font size 35 or something, right? And like, the thing is that, you know, so you can use CSS to target specific elements, but also we can make those elements very specific and target, like, even more specifically elements with a specific class or a specific ID. And all of that is kind of here in the CSS reference in the W3 schools. If you go to the CSS, it'll tell you more about just kind of creating regular CSS based on the elements. But what we're talking about here is called CSS selectors. And there's a number of different ways you can select elements with regards to CSS. So here we're using some of the simple selectors using name or ID or class, but there's all types of other types of selectors within CSS that you can use to target more specific elements as you're working and making your HTML files a little bit more sophisticated. So yeah, go ahead, fam.
Let me ask you a quick question. And the CSS file for the selector, do they have to be in the order that they are in the index, or that doesn't matter?
No, this doesn't matter. The order of these doesn't matter outside of this fact that with CSS, so CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So it's kind of an interesting question because technically the order doesn't matter, except for when, for instance, if I have like this element dot square, right? And this is targeting all of these particular divs with the square class, right? But if I go ahead and add another CSS rule and I say for all the divs, right, I want the border to be, maybe I want the border to be, instead of solid border, I want it to be dashed or something, right? Right, so technically, you know, these are two completely separate CSS rules, but because of the way that CSS works sometimes, this wasn't a great example, but like, because of the way that CSS works sometimes, the order in which you like lay out your elements it can kind of give conflict because it'll look for the last style you gave it. So if so this is kind of difficult because this is kind of difficult to show in this short period of time. But for instance, like the dot square. So let's say instead of this, I just kind of did this, right? And I had one set of div rules here, and then I had another set of div rules here, right? And I saved this, right? So clearly the div rule that this changed was the border, right? So now the border is dashed instead of solid, right? So it took all the elements from here, but then this one got overwritten by this one, right? So sometimes with the way you write your CSS selectors, depending on the order in which they're called, it might mess up like a previous one that you set. So a good idea is to not, if you're gonna put selectors for multiple things, you might as well put them in the same rule, or make sure that you're using something like an ID or something so that you're not conflicting those particular CSS rules. Because here, using this class, this is only targeting elements with the class name square, but this was targeting every div, right? There's something called Selector Specificity, which basically lets you know how much preference is this selector going to get over another selector, right? And so clearly this selector of a class is 010, and this one of a div is 001, right? So this one is going to take precedence over this one, which is exactly why when I put the border here, when I put this border here, it didn't show up. Whoops. This one didn't change, right? So technically, right, we would expect this to change. But if I just switch these order around and I put this as the div and this as the class, right? All of these are going to get dashed now, right? Because the specificity of this particular selector is a little bit higher than this one. So that's one of the tricky things about CSS, is that depending on the order in which you call your selectors, it might mess up a previous selector that you already defined. But if you're like talking about completely separate things, that order doesn't matter, right? I could put the H1 anywhere, right? That doesn't have to reflect the HTML file at all. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, actually, that's very clear. Thank you for clarifying.
Yep, no problem. No, that's a great question and a really important point to know about CSS. So just for the sake of, oh my God, I keep clicking on, keep clicking on random stuff. So just for the sake of today, what we're gonna do is get the board together, and then on Thursday we'll finish it up and kind of talk through some stuff, or and kind of just make sure that we kind of get an understanding of the JavaScript piece. So we'll get the board connected and connect some JavaScript to it to see how the JavaScript works. And then, we'll see how far we can get with this particular, within this particular session. But yeah, so far we got our CSS kind of here. So let me just fix this so that we fix our board up. And I don't need this. That was there for a show. So I got 9 squares, right? 9 things showing up as squares. So what I really want to do is I really want to start to make this HTML file a little bit more board-like, right? So right now we're seeing 9 squares, but they're nowhere near ready for like a tic tac toe game. We need to kind of get them in like a board-like element. So in order to do that, what we're going to need to do is kind of structure out a set, continue to mess around with the HTML and the CSS to like make the structure there and then make the style match that structure. So what we're going to do is change this HTML file up a little bit. And so right now we have 9 kind of loose squares. So I want to put them in like a container that I can wrap them in, that will make it so that they don't just kind of stick out like 9 just random things, but like kind of like can fill another square container in 3x3 like fashion. So whenever I'm messing around with HTML stuff, most times I do like to use divs as the container element. So what I'm going to do is add a div on top of this, on top of these squares, right? So I'm going to wrap all of these squares with a div. And this div is going to be the div that represents the like container for our board. And so I'm going to give this div a particular ID. I'm going to give it an ID called board. And this ID is just going to let this be kind of a unique element on the page. So it's not going to get confused with anything else because there's only one board. And this particular, with this board, right, what we're going to do is use it to kind of contain all of these squares in a more stylistic way for Tic Tac Toe. So in order to do that also, I'm going to want to basically add to this container, this big top level container for the board, some properties called flex, which allow for us in CSS to style a container with different elements inside of it a little bit more specifically. So we're going to use some of the flex properties here. And this is a little bit more intermediate CSS stuff. No worries about all of that, just kind of showing this practically. So just for the sake of here to show the point of like how classes and IDs are different, I can give something both an ID and a class. That's not a problem. What the ID does is it says, hey, this is almost like a unique identifier for this element. So I'm going to say this is my board element, right? And then in the class, I could give this class like any kind of, I could give this any class that I really want, especially if there's like properties there that I might want to use over and over again. So if I wanted to, which I might in a second, I might give this a class. But here in the style sheet, I'm going to want to make some changes to the style sheet to make that board a little bit more sophisticated, right? To make the squares a little bit more oriented for the Tic Tac Toe game, right? So what I want to do is inside of here, I'm going to, I want to give this some specific properties. So I'm going to look for the board, right? And so just like you can target a specific class, you can also target a specific selector. So here with the pound sign or the hashtag sign, you're saying find any element with the ID of board, right? So this particular element, I want this to be kind of a container for my squares, right? So one of the things I'm going to have to do is give it this display flex, which is a property in CSS that allows for you to talk about how you're laying out elements inside of a box. So I'm saying, hey, display the elements inside of this with flex. Just by putting flex on, you can see that now the board, the like 9 squares that this is holding went kind of are now fitted inside of the width of the screen. So we're kind of there, almost there, right? So next thing I want to do is I'm going to add some justifying content and aligning. So I just kind of center all of the elements inside of here and just make sure that kind of everything is going to be vertically and horizontally aligned. So justify content and align items both do some centering of the elements inside of it. And then last thing I'm going to want to do is make it so that this particular container knows how to wrap itself in the way that it needs to, right? So I'm going to give this a wrap, flex wrap of, let's say wrap. And so now we're seeing that it's wrapping, but it's not wrapping in like a way that is like really kind of the way we want 3 by 3 by 3. The way we do that is just to tell it like how is it gonna wrap. So we're gonna say the height of this is gonna be 432 pixels, and that the width is gonna be 432 pixels as well. Cool. And now we kind of got a nice little tic-tac-toe like square kind of grid thing going on there with just a little bit of CSS. And yeah, so just with the CSS, we kind of got the square showing up and we got the board showing up in a pretty decent way. So for now, I'm just going to clean up this this div here that I don't need. Just make sure that there's no extra HTML that I need to have here. But yeah, for the most part, we kind of got everything here. I can do some more stylistic things to, like, for instance, see how everything's kind of left justified. I can make it so that everything on the web page is kind of aligned more in the center. So in order to do that, what I might do is, just like H1 and is an element that we can tag with CSS, we can also target the body element just in and of itself to say, hey, everything inside of here, we want to align a little bit more specifically. So I'm just center the text. And then to center this big box, I could do that by way of, I could do that. Let's see, what's the best way for me to do that? I think the best way for me to do that is to actually add some properties to this square. So I'm gonna just add some properties here. And so let me just play around with my CSS a little bit. And okay, well, no, not the squares, but let's see what might I want to do. I'll figure it out in a second, but I don't want to sweat it too much. Did you have a question? Somebody had raised their hand. You can go ahead and ask. No? Oh. I'm trying to think what I might want to do to center this drawing. I could, so here I got the board, and I'm giving the board kind of its own elements here. Got display flex, justified content, center, align items. We're aligning the items to the center as well. I wonder if yeah, I don't want to take up too much more of y'all's time just tweaking with the CSS, but you can see, like, messing around with the CSS to take a good amount of time just in and of itself. So, you know, we got the essence of it here with the board kind of showing up. We got these different squares. So before we wrap, I do want to show us more of the more important thing, and then maybe on Thursday we can go through and keep hacking on some of the stylistic and other stuff. But now that we have the board showing up, right? The next part of this puzzle is connecting our board to actually be a game, right? So when people go and start playing around with the game, how will the board start to respond to things? So far with regards to the HTML DOM, we have all these elements here. We have an HTML document. Those elements have attributes and style associated to them. But now we want to talk about connecting the JavaScript to this, so that with the JavaScript, we can start doing more interesting things like responding to the clicks and different things that we might want to have happen when a user is playing this game. Oops. So let's just focus on that part first, and then maybe if I still got a little bit of time after, we can talk about the fix this CSS thing right quick. So now that we have a CSS file, we have an HTML file. The next thing we want to do is kind of talk about the JavaScript. So I'm going to add another folder in here. I'm going to call it JS. Again, there's no real need to have it in a folder, except for the fact that I'm trying to make it a little bit more organized. So inside of here, I'm going to create a JavaScript folder, and I'm going to create a file in here. I could call this file particularly anything I want. But typically, one of the things we like to do for JavaScript is follow like the HTML-like syntax and just kind of create an index.js. But I could name this JavaScript file really anything I want. The one that I can't change is the HTML. It's important that this is called index.html. So cool. Now I have a JavaScript file. So I'm just going to write a little bit of JavaScript in here. I'm just going to console log hey from the JS file, right? And now I want to connect that JavaScript file to our HTML. And so this is a pretty another interesting part of like HTML is like, we talked about connecting, linking to CSS, but another thing we can do is connect JavaScript files into our HTML file as well. So with JavaScript files or JavaScript in general, you can add JavaScript in a number of places in the website. You can add it into the body. You can add it into the head. You can add it into the body as an element, but you can also add it in the head as just metadata for the site to know. Normally, I kind of connect the JavaScript in the head, especially if it's just a file that I'm connecting. And it's better normally in the sense of HTML. You'll see when you start learning online, people will be like, oh, you can write your JavaScript inside of your HTML, right? You could just put a script tag and like inside of the script tag, write all your JavaScript in here. But that becomes really kind of clunky and makes your site look a little bit harder to read. So normally especially when you have a JavaScript file, which is really kind of ideal because you can store all your JavaScript in that file. One of the ways that you'll see people connect their JavaScript file to their website is to create a script with a source, and the source is going to be an attribute that points to the specific JavaScript file that we're looking at. So here it's going to be js/index.js for me. And I can close the script tag, right? And so basically now I have this kind of script tag that's saying, hey, I got this JavaScript file, and it's going to start running the JavaScript as soon as it runs. One thing that you can add is another attribute. If you want to have the JavaScript file wait for the page to load before it runs, which in this case I kind of do because I want the JavaScript to know about all of this HTML here. So I'm going to just put this little attribute here so it just waits for the page to finish loading. But now with that script tag and just a little bit of JavaScript written in here, I can see that the JavaScript is connected. So remember before when I was telling you that when we're writing in JavaScript and we're running it with Node on the command line, the console refers to the terminal, right? It prints to the terminal. So if I were on this terminal, and just like we were doing the other day, and I run node index.js, right? Whoops, my bad. It's not in that folder. If I run node and I say JavaScript index.js, right? Because it was inside of another folder, right? It's going to run here in the terminal, right, with Node. But when you connect a JavaScript file to an HTML file like we did here, the console now also refers to the browser's console. So here, if I open up this browser console, I can see that that JavaScript file is now connected and is sending output also to this to the browser. So that's great, because now that means that the JavaScript is running, and I don't need to run Node every time to see the JavaScript's output. I can just look on the browser, especially now because this is tied to a live server. So the server is hosting all three of these files for me, the index.html, the JavaScript, and the CSS files. So every time a change happens, this entire server updates, but this HTML file is connected to the JavaScript with that script that we wrote here. So this script tag is connecting that JavaScript file and allowing us to now have JavaScript in the mix of all of the stuff that we're doing with this HTML stuff. So yeah, this is really cool. This is a big milestone now because now we have all three files kind of connected. We have an HTML file that has kind of the structure of everything we want to see. We have a JavaScript file that we can start writing some JavaScript in here. So now we can start defining the JavaScript for our game, right? And then in the CSS, we have all the styles being defined as well. So the styles for the board are in the CSS. So now if I were, troubleshooting on the front end, right? oh, something's wrong with, I don't have an element here that I need to have, right? I don't have a board. Well, first thing I'm going to need to do is build that board. So I need the elements for that, which is an HTML specific thing, right? Or, oh, we have the board, but we want the style of that board to look a little different. Well, now I know that that's a CSS thing that I'm going to have to work with, right? But now another thing is, oh, well, we have the board, the style's there, but we're missing the actions of like, oh, when we want stuff to happen on this web page when things the user's doing stuff. Well, that's the JavaScript's job, right? And so what we'll see is how the JavaScript uses the DOM functions in order to then make that possible for us to start manipulating this HTML and changing some of the things that the user is seeing. But yeah, before we jump into that, and we'll probably pause there and like get into that a little bit later. But any questions from anybody just in general about those connecting points between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? And if not, feel free to just throw a thumb up as a reaction, so I know that we're kind of good on that, and y'all see kind of how those things are connected. Nice. Appreciate y'all. Cool. Cool. All right, bet. So just trying to think. I'm trying to think. And just playing around real quick with the CSS. I'm gonna just add 2 CSS properties here to see if that fixes stuff. I'm gonna separate out some of the stuff I had in the board into its own set of CSS and see if that helps in troubleshooting this a little bit. So I'm gonna move the wrap stuff here, and then I'm gonna move inside of this container stuff. I'm gonna just move that here. And then in here, cool. And then let me just see if I can add another div to make this aligned better. So let me see if I do this. Oh, there it is. All right. Your boy Cam do know a couple things, or can look up real quick what I gotta do. So I was missing the I needed to put the whole box in another box so that it knew how to align that whole box. But that's what I'm saying. CSS can get tricky because you gotta like really mess around a lot to get the styles the way that you would expect. But now we kind of got a nice little tic-tac-toe kind of board like setup here. So for the last like couple minutes, what I'll show y'all is how will we go about structuring this JavaScript game, right? So now we have JavaScript connected, and everything kind of is built the way that it needs to with regards to the HTML and CSS. We almost don't even need to look at those anymore because those are kind of already good. So now we're gonna just have to think about how will we build a tic-tac-toe kind of game out of just JavaScript? And this is where that whole thing of the DOM comes up, right? And JavaScript can do a lot with regards to this HTML. And the best place to go to understand that is understanding the document object model functions or methods. So document object model methods are actions that you can perform on HTML elements. So these are things that we can tell JavaScript to do to like kind of mess around with the HTML that we have there. Everything that the document object model returns is defined as an object, which is great because in JavaScript we use objects to like kind of denote different data in and of itself in general. So the fact that the DOM returns objects makes it very easy for JavaScript to work with those objects and and change things about them. So some of the most important DOM functions that you'll see are things like get element by ID, which is a function that you can use in JavaScript to find a particular element by an ID name, right? Inner HTML is like another function that you can use to get content inside of an element using JavaScript. But there's a number of different DOM functions that we use in order to manipulate the HTML that we're working with in very unique ways. And so just to kind of give us a precursor of how that will work, right? Because I know we're kind of running out of time just for right now. First thing I'm going to do is kind of just set up the document so that we kind of have a set of different, kind of sections that are important for this particular JavaScript file. So I'm gonna get rid of this console log because I don't really need it. So here I'm gonna have some constant values that might be important to define. Later, I'm gonna have just kind of like, let's say like some app state variables. So these might be things that change over time inside of the application. Just say cached element references. And so these will be where we kind of talk about elements that like once JavaScript finds some elements, we might save them in some specific variables there. And then, yeah, we're gonna need some functions, right? So we're gonna need some functions to kind of make the whole thing work. And so yeah, working with JavaScript is really interesting because there's a lot of different types of data that we might work with. We might have, especially in a game like this, we might have some very like important data that we want to save in order to make the game work. And so just for the sake of kind of showing y'all a little bit more of like this kind of document object model and functional things, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just kind of show you how we can use JavaScript to connect to those elements and give us some like references to certain things that are going to making this game possible easier. So the most important thing that you probably are like, okay, well, you know, how are we going to make Tic Tac Toe work? Well, how does this game work in general? Well, every time a user clicks on one of these squares, it's going to be our job to essentially basically know when the user clicked on one of these squares and then like basically say, oh, you clicked on this square and it was X's turn. So we're going to mark that with an X. So we're going to mark that with an O. So the most important first thing we need to know is within the JavaScript, can we get a reference to all of these different squares so we can know when a specific when something's taking place on that particular element, right, within these squares. So that's be the last thing we kind of touch on today, and then we'll kind of talk about the last bit in a separate kind of video or whatnot, because I know this is kind of getting a little long. So first thing I'm going to show is like, how can we use the JavaScript to like manipulate some of this information on the with regards to our game. So before we even do this and start like messing around with this stuff with JavaScript on the for the game, let's just talk about how the document object model works. So with JavaScript, we get access to a specific object called the document, and the document will refer to whatever HTML document this JavaScript the JavaScript is connected to. So we know that this index.js is connected to the document that we were working on earlier, that HTML document. So whenever we want to make use of a document object model function, we have to start it off with this document name, variable name. So this is like a built-in variable to JavaScript that knows to like source from the document that we're connected to. Inside of the document are all types of different properties and functions. Everything with a purple box here is a function. Everything with a blue box is like a property. So like it gives you back some data. But just look at all the functions that are here, right? Create element, like, let's see, get element by ID. So finding elements, right? think there's some stuff with regards to, remove things, right? And delete things. So all types of functions that we can use. And like I mentioned, one of the most important functions that you use often in the, some of the most important functions you use often in this space with the document object model, get element by ID, get elements by class name, tag name, etc. And then one of the other most important ones is query for selector and query selector all. So the query selector and query selector all uses a specific selector, kind of like CSS, right? To find a set of tag or a set of elements that have that particular selector. So for instance, I might want to find all of the squares inside of my HTML document. Well, I know that there's multiple squares, so I don't want to use query selector because query selector returns just one element. It says it returns the first element that is the descendant of the node that matches the selectors. Query selector all returns all of the elements that are the descendants of a node that match selectors. So one of the things that this function does is it looks through, it takes in some parameter of like a selector, right? And so if you think about selectors, you might think about what I was saying with CSS. So all of these types of things are selectors, right? So it takes a selector and it gives you back all of the different elements that are descendants from that element. So basically, if you think about this tree in the DOM, it says, oh, if you query for one specific element, I'll give you all of the descendant elements. I'll give you all the elements that are underneath it in the tree. So for us, we don't really want to go too high. We want to get the elements that are relevant to our board, right? And in the side of our board, we have all these squares. So the squares are the elements that I want to retrieve, right? So if I wanted to retrieve all these elements, I'd probably want to get back this element so that it gives me all of these children or descendants in the tree, right? And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to use the query selector all to essentially say, hey, I want to find all of the corresponding elements that are underneath the board, right? And that are of type div, right? So if we type this this selector in the CSS, it'll be really helpful to kind of see what elements come back with a selector like this. If I see board div, right? So this is saying for every element, find the element with ID board that is a div, that is inside of it is a div, right? So this selector is going to target anything underneath the board element that's a div, which for us in our HTML is exactly what we need to get back all of these squares, right? It's going to find this board and it says, okay, everything that's a div underneath this are these elements, right? So what we're going to see is with this document query selector all, this should give us back all of the elements that are of type, that are our squares. So one last thing I'm going to do before we wrap for today is I'm just going to say, okay, cool. I'm going to set this equal to some variable, right? So I'm going to give it a variable of squares for right now. And in the next line, I'm just going to console.log squares. And so like I said, because this JavaScript file is already connected to the HTML, I can actually just see the output inside of the console if I inspect and go to the console, right? So, and here we got back this console log gives us back a node list. And I don't know what a node list is too much. Like it's basically an element that comes back from the document object model. But if we look, it kind of is interesting. It has 0, goes from 0 to 8. It's length 9. It's supposed to be a list, but each element inside of this node list returns a different div.square. And clearly those divs are corresponding to the same squares that we're seeing on the left side being highlighted from our board. So this is showing us that we're using the JavaScript to get back this list of items from our board that are relevant for the game, right? We're getting all the squares, which is really dope. Problem is, node list isn't really the most colloquially friendly data type. We don't know a data type called node list, but what does this sound like? A list, right? Well, a better data type that we can use in JavaScript to represent this is an array, right? So maybe what we might want to do next is rather than just like leave this, the document query selector all is going to return that node list. So then maybe what we want to do instead is turn this into an array. And so luckily in JavaScript, we can use the array class to create an array from something that is a list. So what we're going to just do is wrap this in parentheses and say, okay, hey, let's make an array from this. So take this query selector all thing that we just did, and let's make an array out of it, right? And so saving that and running that again, clearly we got a nice array come back with the same kind of principles of all of the divs tied as squares, which is great. So we got our first step of connecting a JavaScript and making it so that we can start messing around with the board and starting to interact with it a little bit more and make our game work. So I'm gonna pause there, and I also know we kind of pressed for time. So in the next session, we'll go through that, and I'll probably just finish that up. But yeah, this is basically how all of these things get connected: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Clearly, now that we kind of getting this data back from the squares, we can start doing some very interesting things because this data now is just an array. So because this is now data that's inside of this JavaScript file, well, now I can actually start messing around, creating some functions, making some other changes that will make this game actually work, and build the Tic Tac Toe game as it actually needs to be. So these are the first steps that you need to do in order to connect HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We talked a little bit about the HTML Dom, which allows us to take the HTML and CSS that we wrote and manipulate them with JavaScript. And that's what we're starting to do here in this JavaScript file by using some of these document object model functions like query selector all, which are going to allow us to use that JavaScript to manipulate that HTML in unique ways that can make our whole web page a little bit more interactive. So yeah, if you want to tune in for more resources, again, I would say look through the W3 schools on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then, also I'll post some more in the Slack that I think are helpful for folks to continue on their own. So yes, we'll pick it back up